Hi there, everyone. My name's Phil Cowan, and I thought I would share with you my end of season report PowerPoint presentation that I gave to my colleagues that studied alongside me doing the Level 4 Queen Rearing course run through Otago Polytech. Course convener is this chap here, David Woodward, who you may have heard of. He is the author of this book. So, after the season queen rearing, we have to create a presentation where we analyse and evaluate the seasonal queen breeding and pest disease management plan in relation to meeting the requirements of a queen rearing business. Now, when we first started the course, we were set some objectives and we had to plan the year out, come up with an operational cost, a budget, work out the timings of when we would graft. So this was quite a comprehensive process. You'll see there on the left-hand side a calendar. That was when I was in the planning stages of coming up with my seasonal plan. So the objectives that we were given as part of running our business was to produce 100 queen cells weekly from October to December, 100 queen cells per week from January to March, and then you'll see there over the season produce 100 nukes. So quite a challenging task when you're working full time, but we all got it done. Didn't quite make 100 cells a week as individuals, but as a group we were able to do that quite easily. So looking back on the year, how did it all go? Now, we used an apiary site that we hadn't experienced before. There were a variety of setbacks. The apiary site was ideal in that it was only a few hundred metres away from the classroom, but the setbacks including COVID-19 lockdown, weather events that were record flooding and record rain events. So we had a lot of rain in the lead up to Christmas, so the bees couldn't get out, they couldn't forage. Then after that, when that all cleared, we had record heat, so the nectar dried up in a lot of the floral sources. There wasn't that many floral sources around. It was a real challenging site in that regard. And this is in Greytown. I'm based in Otaki, but I travelled to Greytown to this apiary. And in Greytown, there are apiaries everywhere. Some companies over there have 11,000 hives, so there's a lot of nutrition competition. We stopped for Christmas and New Year, which you can't really afford to do, to stop the hives from swarming, because when you have queen rearing hives, you need them at peak condition all the time, on the verge of swarming, but not quite swarming. So to prevent our hives from swarming, in the lead up to Christmas, the few days for Christmas, a few days before Christmas, we made splits out of the cell builders, which weakened them. So when we came back in January, they weren't as good as they could have been. Now, where we were was next door to a college, which was fine on the weekends until sporting season started. So we had to compete it with cricket and a few other sporting events. So we had scheduled in grafting days. We came to do our grafting, however, kids were getting stung next door, so we'd have to shut everything down and then come back another time. We would prefer to graft in the afternoons, but sometimes this wasn't something that we could do. Okay, we required a lot of supplementary feeding, which, it comes at a cost in terms of financial cost and labour cost. That's simply because there was a lack of nectar in the area, lack of pollen, and high competition from a variety of other beekeeping operations. And just like all other beekeepers, we had mite issues. but we had them quite bad. We bought a whole heap of hives from different areas, some as far as Arakuni, Palmerston, Otaki, um, Wellington, Wairarapa. So we brought all our best hives together, but they were foraging and picked up mites. Um, usually you try and keep on top of your mites, and we did have our treatments going, but learning from other beekeepers in the area, we weren't the only people with mite issues in the area. One of the large operations there that had 11,000 hives, they treat 4 times a year, and they have dedicated staff that are queen rearing, and that's how they keep on top of their mite problem. So high mite load wasn't in our favour, so we wanted to investigate this problem a little bit more to find out why, well, if our treatments were actually that we were using were actually working. So we done a series of alcohol washes, grouped the hives together in 3 different groups, group A, B, and C, and we also done hygienic tests. Middle picture there shows the oxalic acid and glycerin strips that we made and trialed. So our mite problem, luckily enough, developed into a little study that I'd done along with the other people in the course. So our 3 groups, group 1, group 2, group 3, you'll see there we done on the 25th of January, we done a so this is after the honey flow. We didn't use these hives for honey flow, but we're all busy chasing bees around trying to get honey supers off, so we decided to do this after the honey flow when our autumn treatments were going in. So we done an alcohol wash on a group of hives and averaged the mite load out pre-treatment. So that was done 25th January, and you'll see group 1, which was to be treated with Baverol, had an average mite load of 5.3%. Group 2, which was to be treated with only oxalic acid strips, the average mite load was 2.2%, and group 3, which was to be treated half and half, so half Baverol, half oxalic acid strips, that had a mite load of 2.6%. Now you've got to remember that where you have a varroa problem, so 1% mite load is considered to be a problem. Anything under is cause for alarm. Ideally you want it at 0, but we don't often all get there all at the same time. Okay, with the mite problem, we were trying to graft 50 cells per hive per grafting. So we found that this wasn't always successful. So to increase our success rate, one of the reasons why we done the study was to find out how we could increase our success rate. Because the bees were struggling with mite, it wasn't always a good outcome. So next slide there. So at the end of the treatment period, on the 10th of March, we resampled. So the group treated with Baverol, their end mite treatment was 2.3%. Group 2, which was treated with only oxalic acid strips, 1.3%, and then group 3, which was treated with both, 0.5%. Now remember, like I just said in the previous slide, 1% is cause for alarm. You want to keep your mite load under 1%. So it shows that even with the 6 to 8 week, I think it was 6 weeks that we used Baverol treatment for, the end result is that the mite load is not low enough. Same with just using oxalic acid glycerin strips, 1.3. The combination of the two, 0.5, which isn't too bad. So, as I was saying, group 1 was the best with an average mite drop of 3%. Group 2, which was oxalic acid treatment, average mite drop of, say, 0.9%. And group 3, combination of both, 2%. So, could we do what we needed to do for our business objectives? 100 sales a week, 100 nukes over the season with mated queens. Now, in a word, not really. As a combined group of grafters, we were able to produce 100 a week quite easily. On that particular site, no one had used it before for queen rearing, so we didn't know how it would go, but in my records, we have about, for my grafting, I had about a 60 to 80% success rate. We wouldn't have been able to supply 100 nukes through the season off that apiary simply because the mite load was too high. The bees just weren't boosted enough. We've fed them a lot, invert sugar syrup. They had pollen patties, but they just weren't performing as well as we would like them to. And from the factors I've just explained, lack of natural nutrition in the area, also the high number of beehives in the area. Bees go robbing, bees get robbed, and then they share mutual foraging grounds. Now, there's 3 different types of deformed wing virus, and deformed wing virus B is quite a problem, and that is so contagious that a wasp or bee, wasp also carry deformed wing virus, can land in a flower, for example, leave, and then your bees go in, they get some nectar, but they also get the virus and bring that home. Okay, so how did we manage this problem to get our queens? Well, we simply reduced the quantity of grafts that we were making and focused on quality rather than quantity. So rather than having two cell builder hives with grafts of 50 in each, we went to 25. And, you know, if you read the book, if you do a lot of research, speak to queen rearers, better fed bees, better fed grafts result in better queen bees. So improvements that you can make throughout the season, one, in my opinion, don't follow a calendar plan because there is so much unpredictable variation. You don't know what the weather's going to do. You don't know, if you haven't been to that apiary before, used that apiary before, you don't know how it's going to perform. You might be competing against sports or your next door neighbours for space to have your bees. You know, there isn't much of a market for queen bees in that a lot of the big honey production companies have their own dedicated staff. Companies want to protect their own intellectual property and benefit from their research and their developments in-house. There is a market, however, for instrumentally inseminated first generation bees, but the problem there is that the traits that they were bred for are only useful in the first generation, and then they're bred out. They're just the way bees replicate themselves, and there's a lot of genetic variability. The traits get diluted out. Another problem is that the Manuka honey sales have dropped. Currently, China isn't importing because some parts of China anyway, because they're in lockdown. Lots of beehives are for sale on the internet, lots of beekeeping businesses. It's not a good time. So In order to make better queen cells and adapt, you need 110% commitment, and you need to be extremely flexible to match the grafting conditions. You know, if the sun's out, you got to be grafting. You got to change what you're doing with the weather. You've got to manage robbing. You've got to manage your site, and you've got to manage your mites. So a little picture here of some of the hygienic testing I was doing in one particular hive. So we were monitoring a hive for 2 months. Okay, so in improving, we want to work with the winter solstice. So as the sunlight increases, duration of sunlight increases, plants have a better chance of growing, and with that, plants reproduce. They produce flowers that produce nectar, which reward the bees for pollinating them. So the bees get the nectar and they get the pollen. There is a correlation between the way bees reproduce in the hive, in that as they have better food sources, they reproduce more. Okay, so they also produce drones when things are going well, and in particular, what we could do better is make sure that we are creating drones by using dedicated drone frames within breeder hives. People look at a frame and go, oh, they're nice bees to graft from. I'll make sure I graft them. But you want to increase your drone populations in your apiaries and surrounding areas. It's very hard these days to get an isolated area to have your mating. So by increasing the number of drones in your area, that's going to help your cause. So 4, good nutrition creates good queens. Ensure your bees are well fed. So regardless of their natural nutrition resources, still feed them some inverted sugar syrup. You can't overfeed bees. You can underfeed them, but you can't overfeed them. Okay, well-fed larvae become bigger queen bees because there is a correlation between nutrition and ovary size. The bigger the ovary size, the better egg capacity. So you could also increase the number of hives you have if you're making nukes to source brood from, because you don't want to be draining your cell builder hive of nuke or of brood comb, or bees to make nukes, because it's just not going to perform as a cell builder as well, and that's going to offset the drain you have on the hive. So if you have a dedicated set of cell builders, half a dozen cell builders, also have a dedicated set of brood suppliers for when you make your nukes. Also, you've got to change the way your customers order. So we're in April now. In March, as early as March, you can see Alfie Smith there. He's a big beekeeper on the South Island. He's already getting orders in for his spring summer sales. Okay, so encourage autumn ordering, because that's going to give you a goal and something to work a strategy to get your bees ready for sale. Okay, and then if you're doing it in autumn, you can make use of your end of season bees. So you've taken your honey supers off, you've got excess bees beating out the front of the hive, there's no room for them, so you can make some splits and nukes. Not only will that get you prepared for wintering through and hopefully coming out the other side, you'll have splits ready to go at spring to sell, and you've overwintered your top queens, which you'll graft from. Disease and pest management, new thinking. Okay, so you've got to think of why mites are a problem for bees. One, having a dinner plate sized parasite chomping away at you is obviously a problem, but the bees carry viruses, okay, and there's 30 different viruses that affect bees that we know of, and bees don't produce antibodies to these viruses. So Dr. Phil Lester from the Victoria University of Wellington has sampled hives from all over New Zealand, and every single hive they've found has deformed wing virus in low amounts. And you can find deformed wing virus in hives without the presence of mites, because like I explained earlier, deformed wing virus is quite contagious. It's carried by wasps, it's carried by ants, it's carried by bumblebees, it's carried by honeybees. Okay, so there's different strains of deformed wing virus that we know of, strain A, B, and C. B is increasing. Of these 30 viruses that we know of, there is another virus called Varroa destructor virus number 2, and it is a potentially useful virus. So Dr. Phil Lester's studies have shown that in the presence of deformed wing virus number 2, there is a low presence of deformed wing virus B. So you have a viral-viral interaction. One virus keeps the other at bay. Just as with HIV, hepatitis keeps HIV levels low. And, you know, it's the principle of immunology in that bees don't produce antibodies, but having another virus in the bee, the Varroa destructor number 2, that presence keeps deformed wing virus B at bay. Higher levels of deformed, higher levels of Varroa destructor virus number 2 equals smaller amounts of deformed wing virus B. And deformed wing virus B is spreading, and it's pretty bad. Probably well before my beekeeping time, 20-something years ago, the presence of mites, the earlier anecdotal evidence, beekeepers would say that their hives were riddled with Varroa mites, but the hive was still surviving. And that sort of explains a bit of the issues there, where deformed wing virus B was in a lower concentration. And as it's progressed, you know, the bees are really struggling. So you've got to think of that the problem, part of the problem are the mites, but the real issue is that mites are a taxi for these viruses, and it's the viruses that really cause damage. So in countries overseas, they've been experimenting by feeding bees antibodies. So you can actually infect a chicken, give it a subcutaneous injection of deformed wing virus, and the chicken produces AGY antibodies. And this conveniently is concentrated in the egg yolk. Now that egg yolk, you don't have to kill the chicken to get it, so that can be fed to larvae, and that gives them antibodies against deformed wing virus. So it's not a new technology. There's currently trials in America where they're using something similar to coronavirus vaccine. So they're using mRNA immunology principles that's in sugar syrup, and they're trialing it on bee colonies in the States right now. Okay, so there is another strategy in that you can use mRNA vaccines if you use double-stranded RNA gene silencing. So you feed the bees a vaccine, if you want to call it that goes into their system, goes into their lipid stores. The mites eat the lipids, and it silences a gene in the mite Varroa mites' reproductive system so they can't reproduce. Okay, so this is possibly the future of pest and disease management in relation to the Varroa destructor. Now, okay, improvements on breeder and grafting hives. Single season use of queens. What I mean by this is that in New Zealand it's become widely acceptable to help increase production. Queens are only given life for one season and then they're requeened. So you need to constantly monitor your hives for good production, good traits that you want to replicate. But it is only the first generation bees that will have some of these traits due to the genetic recombination of bees when they reproduce. These traits are just going to be diluted out after that first generation. Drone saturation. You want to make sure that you have lots of drones in your apiary because they carry the genes of the queens. Okay, so this is just I won't go too much into this. This is a modified system that we use to breed breeder queens. You're using a mini nuke frame because you're trying to limit the amount of eggs the queen can lay, because you want to be able to pull that frame out and graft directly from it, because it will save you a lot of losses, because once you remove that frame from the hive, it isn't at the same temperature and it isn't getting the same care. So by having it on a smaller scale, you can just pull one little frame out and put it straight back in after you've grafted it from it. And there's a few different methods that you use the system with, but I won't go into too much detail there. And this is a diagram that I drew to explain the way you select different traits when you're trying to get different pools of traits in your bees. But it comes down to drone saturation, making sure that you've got drones to breed with queens. So you pick out a hive, for example, site 1 has good honey production. You use the queen there to graft from, but you use that hive as well to create drones, and those drones go to, say, site 2, where you have another set of traits where you're trying to cause these interactions, and then some of the bees, not all the bees, some of the bees that go on to become queens carry these traits, but you have to keep constantly observing. The only way to really control this is to do artificial instrumental insemination, but that requires more skill, more equipment, more cost, and more labour. Okay. Now, when we talk about selecting bees, people talk about Varroa resistance. Better bees, we had a chat with Franz Lars, from former manager of Better Bees in the South Island, and they abandoned breeding bees for hygiene behaviour in relation to Varroa, simply because the bees were resistant to Varroa mite infestation, but they didn't produce excess honey, which is a problem if you're trying to sell Manuka. Okay, for example, it's the recombination of the genes within bees is so rapid, and there could be 70 genes responsible for one trait. So that's why I say some of the bees will carry the trait, because you've got to have all these bees genes working either on and off in 70 different areas to make it happen. Okay, so a statement I come up with Before I started the course, we were asked to come up with a statement about queen rearing, and my statement was finding the balance and being adaptable to unpredicted variation of weather, food sources, and many countless factors between knowing the needs of the customers and having stock on hand despite having a 30-day lag period, which is the period it sort of takes to have a mated queen sometimes, is the art of queen rearing. Timing will differ from year to year, and balancing what the client wants and when, and being one step in front of those unpredictable variations will ultimately dictate the range of flexibility you have with the client in your delivery. So basically what I'm saying there is you can't plan, you've just got to go with what you've got and make adaptations. You know, you want to graft tomorrow, but it's pouring down with rain. You've got to wait until you have better conditions. So yeah, that sort of sums up a bit of a year in queen rearing, in case anyone's interested in taking on the course. It's a lot of work out in the field, making it all happen, and a lot of time spending doing assignments, but I found it really worthwhile and good to learn heaps more. Done my level 3 agricultural course about 3 years ago and wanted to do this course, but it was only offered in Otago. But this time around, I was lucky that there was enough students on the North Island to get it happening, and because we've all become used to doing things online, we were able to learn a lot online with Zoom conferences and then meet out in the field. So yeah, I hope that was useful. Yeah, thanks very much.